During the 4 years it was fought, it went by many names. The War for States' Rights, Mr. Lincoln's War, the War for Southern Nationality, the War for Separation, the War for Union, the War between the States, the Second War of Independence, the Brothers' War, the Lost Cause. To historians, it became known as the American Civil War, the Civil War for short. It was a civil war in name only. Survivors of its great battles, First Bull Run, Shiloh, Second Bull Run, Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, and Petersburg would later remember the Civil War as the last gentleman's war. But that was only after hard memories had been gently effaced by time. Over 100 years later, the Civil War remains the deadliest war ever launched in the Western Hemisphere. It was also one of history's most divisive and disastrous conflicts, tearing a nation apart and pitting brother against brother. A house divided against itself, Abraham Lincoln said, cannot stand. Yet between 1861 and 1865, the American home literally was split in two and the country torn asunder. Americans fought Americans. The lines were drawn roughly between North and South, but conflicting loyalties blurred the apparent clear distinctions. Men from the North bid their lovers farewell and donned Confederate uniforms, convinced that states' rights were imperiled by the Lincoln administration. Men from Dixie kissed their mothers goodbye and headed north to join Union forces, convinced that black slavery could only be removed by force. Even the president himself experienced the war's terrible pull of loyalties. 4 of Lincoln's brothers-in-law enlisted with the Confederates, and the president watched as states such as Kentucky and Delaware contributed equal numbers of willing recruits to both sides. Like so many wars, it started out with flag waving, drum beating, boasting, and high expectations. Men flooded recruiting stations, anxious to sign up. They bristled when they were forced to master rudimentary military drills on parade grounds far from the fighting, and they feared that the war would be over before they had their chance to fight and attain glory. But the Civil War lasted 4 years, and soldiers on both sides lived to see the folly of their merry lust for battle. And then they died. In the end, the United States lost 5% of its population in the Civil War. Most of the 600,000 killed were mere boys, extinguished by the flames of war, along with hundreds of thousands of troops, were the tranquil dreams of families from Florida to Maine, and from Virginia to California. But out of the ashes arose a better union, forever changed. No longer was it one part free, one part slave. But that was in the end, after the blood had been let, and the casualties piled high in the nation's terrible and dark atonement. The Civil War officially commenced on April 12, 1861, when Confederate forces under General B.T. Beauregard bombarded a Union fort in South Carolina's Charleston Harbor. But the profound tensions and deep-seated hostility between North and South, and behind the disastrous conflict that would engulf the nation, had been festering for a long time. Long before the Southern states began seceding from the Union and forming the Confederate States of America, there were in fact already 2 Americas, or at least 2 separate cultures, slowly but inevitably growing apart. The North was a fast-growing urban industrial region, The South, a rural, agricultural, slow-growing region. As the North's population swelled through immigration, the South's remained static. What was good for the North was not always good for the South. The high tariffs on foreign goods, set by several administrations in Washington, for example, protected young industries in the Northwest, but hurt Southern cotton growers who, dependent as they were on cotton exports, desperately needed cheap foreign goods to fulfill their material needs. Cotton was king. The Southerners never tired of pointing that out, accounting for some 57% of all American exports. High tariffs in America only invited high tariffs on American cotton, prohibiting export and effectively shutting down the Southern economy. Unfortunately, trade policy wasn't the only issue dividing North and South. The connection between cotton and slavery was beginning to weigh heavily on certain consciences in the North. During the 1830s and 1840s, opposition to slavery spread throughout the Northeast, and abolitionist societies and newspapers were established in many cities and states. At first, the anti-slavery forces merely opposed the extension of slavery into more United States territory and hoped that the South's peculiar institution would gradually wither and die in the states where it was already established. Over time, however, the abolitionists grew in numbers and their demands became more far-reaching. The problem was that slavery was essential to the Southern cotton industry. When abolitionists such as William Lloyd Garrison called for an end to black servitude, cotton planters heard him calling for the end of their livelihoods. Southerners resented the abolitionists and the sympathetic hearing they seemed to be getting from the influential policymakers in the North. Blacks made up 40% of the South's population and were reckoned to be worth some $2 billion to the Southern economy. As the abolitionists raised their voices higher and higher, demanding an end to Southern slavery without ever talking about compensation, Southerners began talking about states' rights as a tactic to protect themselves from the federal government, which they considered a body controlled by hostile enemies. While abolitionists argued that Congress had the duty to prohibit slavery wherever it could, the Southerners demanded not only that Congress had no power to prohibit the peculiar institution, but that it had the duty to protect it. The lines were clearly drawn. The festering hatred and suspicion came to a head in 1854 with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. According to the law, citizens in the new states of Kansas and Nebraska would decide for themselves whether they would have slavery or not. This idea of popular sovereignty, though an attempt to defuse the explosive issue of slavery by putting it in the hands of the new states, touched off mad immigration to the two new territories as pro- and anti-slavery forces attempted to get to the states first. As they scrambled to gain an upper hand, the abolitionists and the Southern sympathizers armed themselves and clashed. The territory became known as Bleeding Kansas, as opponents staged raids on one another. It was in Kansas that John Brown, the radical anti-slavery crusader, first drew blood. At the so-called Potawatomi Massacre, Brown murdered at least 5 Southern settlers. Later, in 1859, Brown attempted to spark off a slavery insurrection by seizing a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry in Virginia and issuing weapons to blacks. Although Brown was quickly forced to surrender, His plot had killed the town's southern mayor and spread panic in the South. Looking at developments in Kansas and at Brown's bloody-mindedness in both Kansas and Virginia, Southerners feared that their very livelihoods were at stake. They developed a hardline attitude toward slavery and upped the ante, insisting that slavery would either be protected and extended into all new territories in the Union, or they would be forced to secede to protect themselves. When Abraham Lincoln, running on the platform supporting protective tariffs and opposing the extension of slavery, won the 1860 presidential election with a whopping 180 electoral votes, the fears of Southerners seemed to be confirmed. The overthrow of Southern society by Northern agitators who controlled the federal government appeared imminent. The South swiftly reacted to the perceived threat. On Christmas Eve, 1860, South Carolina declared its independence, quickly followed by Alabama, Florida, Mississippi, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. On the 8th of February, 1861, delegates from the 7 rebel states met in Montgomery, Alabama, and formed the Confederate States of America, electing Jefferson Davis, a former soldier, senator, and Secretary of War, as Confederate president. The twin pillars of the new nation were states' rights and the legality of slavery. Attempts to bring the 7 states back into the Union by compromise failed, and the Confederates began seizing federal arsenals and forts in their territory. It was against this background of coming war that Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated as president on March 4th, 1861. As the grim president and his entourage walked towards the White House, onlookers said it seemed more like a funeral than a celebration of victory. Although Lincoln made peaceful overtures to the South on that cold, glum day, his speech was a thinly veiled warning. In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, is the momentous issue of civil war. You can have no conflict without yourselves being the aggressor. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. The South ignored Lincoln's ominous tone. Earlier, the Confederate States had resolved to take Forts Sumter and Pickens, the last 2 remaining federal installations in the Confederate States. Major Anderson, the U.S. soldier in charge at Fort Sumter, was asked by the Confederates to surrender the fort. When Anderson refused, the Confederates prepared to bomb him out. On April 12th, 1861, at 4 a.m., the first shots rang out in the Civil War as Confederate General B.T. Beauregard pummeled the fort with a massive artillery bombardment. After sustaining 36 hours of shelling, Anderson accepted the terms of surrender offered by Beauregard and marched his men out of the fort. Amazingly, no one on either side was killed during the ferocious cannon fight. It was the last time that would happen. The American Civil War had begun. The awful carnage would quickly follow. Lincoln responded to the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter by calling for volunteers to serve for 90 days to put down the secessionary movement. Northerners responded to Confederates firing on the American flag and to Lincoln's call to arms by flooding recruiting offices. But 4 previously neutral Southern states, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, responded to Lincoln's call by abandoning their neutrality and joining the Confederacy. Papers in the North began calling for a quick drive against Richmond, Virginia, which had been named the capital of the Confederacy. It was clear that the North expected a quick victory. The Confederate war aims were clear. They would attempt to defend their independence. Confederate strategy was clear too, using the advantage of interior lines and taking a defensive posture. They would repulse any attempts by Northern armies to enter the South. Over time, Southern strategists argued the North would be worn down by a war that was too difficult to win. For President Lincoln, the aim of this war was to preserve the Union. His strategy, therefore, had to be aggressive. His armies had to occupy Confederate territory, defeat Confederate armies, and topple the Confederate government. Toppling the Confederate government in Richmond, a mere 100 miles from Washington, where the Army of the Potomac was massing, seemed the easiest and most symbolic move, and it was quickly chosen. Lincoln's commander, General Winfield Scott, ordered his subordinate, General McDowell, to cross the Potomac into Virginia, seek out the Confederate Army defending Richmond, defeat it, and move on to the capital. So sure were the Unionists that their victory would be swift and decisive that they allowed sightseers to follow them as they hunted down the Confederate forces near Manassas Junction, Virginia, under the command of General Beauregard, the Confederate hero of Fort Sumter. On July 21st, 1861, the first significant battle of the Civil War took place when General McDowell's troops clashed with Beauregard's Confederate forces near a creek called Bull Run. The pro-Union spectators, optimistic that their boys would give Johnny Reb a sound thrashing, were stunned by what they witnessed. The Confederates had known that the attack was coming, and Beauregard was able to reinforce his 25,000 men with 10,000 more under the command of General Joseph E. Johnston. While waiting for Johnston's arrival, Beauregard's men stationed themselves by a stone bridge on the road from Washington. Both Beauregard and McDowell had the same plan, to hold their left flanks and strike with their rights. Due to the inexperience of the raw recruits under their charge, both generals' plans failed. When the two confused armies finally made contact, at about 9 a.m. on July 21st, 1861, Union forces under Colonel Ambrose Burnside quickly drove back Confederate pickets and forced the entire Southern Army to drop back under heavy fire from Union artillery batteries. Just as the Confederates seemed to be pinned down at their lines on the Henry House Hill, General Johnston arrived on the scene with reinforcements, including a group of Virginians under Brigadier General Thomas J. Jackson. Jackson threw his men into the line on the hill and kept them there. When one Confederate general saw his own line hemorrhaging, he waved toward Jackson's line and told his men to rally there. Jackson, he said, was standing like a stone wall. From then on, General Thomas J. Jackson became known as Stonewall Jackson. Sensing victory, Union commanders moved their artillery closer to the action at Henry House Hill, but the move proved costly. The Union cannons now came under terrible rifle fire, and the gunners were cut down. The Confederates took advantage of the lull in artillery fire to counterattack the batteries. The guns were quickly silenced. The Confederates rallied and subjected Union troops to cavalry harassment. Surveying the situation, General McDowell decided to pull back and regroup his Union forces in preparation for a counterattack on the Confederates. But his poorly trained troops were quite incapable of withdrawing in an orderly fashion while subjected to Confederate fire, and they began to run. The Union retreat became a rout, and the road to Washington became crowded with fleeing soldiers and frightened civilian onlookers. Stonewall Jackson urged Beauregard and Johnston to allow him to carry the battle to Washington. But looking at their weary men, Beauregard and Johnson held back. Though the Confederates had won the day, they were in no better shape than the fleeing Union soldiers. By Civil War standards, casualties at Bull Run were low. Of the 15,000 men McDowell had been able to swing into battle, some 500 were dead, 1,000 wounded, and 1,200 captured. The Confederates, on the other hand, lost 350 soldiers and had some 1,500 wounded from the 35,000 men they fielded against the North. The poor training and organization of both armies at this, the first Battle of Bull Run, made a later German strategist sick. He said he saw no point in having his students study the Civil War, since it had been fought by armed mobs, not soldiers. At Bull Run, that was true. After Bull Run, several months passed without any real combat. The South consolidated its position in northern Virginia. In the North, Union forces came to the realization that the war would take more than 90 days, and Lincoln set about replacing the defeated McDowell. His choice was Major General John B. McClellan, a young West Pointer who had fought at First Bull Run. During the 9 months following that battle, McClellan concerned himself with his most pressing task, preparing an army that was properly trained, properly equipped, and properly disciplined. The reality of Confederate strength and determination had been made clear at Bull Run, and McClellan needed to raise an army that could fight. Although he moved slowly, McClellan's care and attention impressed the president, and by November 1861, he'd been appointed General-in-Chief of all Union armies. In early 1862, McClellan's forces on the northern Mississippi swung into action. Confederate strongholds at Forts Henry and Donelson fell to the Union after one of its little-known soldiers, a certain Ulysses S. Grant, demanded and got an unconditional surrender from Confederate General Simon Buckner. Grant's victory was spectacular, making Nashville unoccupiable for the Confederates. Grant followed this up with another victory in the Battle of Shiloh, when the Confederates attempted to regain the upper hand in Tennessee, but were repulsed by Grant. Yet the cost of this, the first major Union victory, was appalling. Out of 55,000 Union troops, 13,000 were dead. Of the Confederates' 42,000 soldiers, 11,000 were dead. It was the first battle of the Civil War where the carnage appalled even battle-hardened soldiers. It was not to be the last. Ulysses S. Grant was an unlikely hero. Originally a captain in the Mexican-American War, Grant had fallen into drunkenness after the conflict and resigned to avoid court-martial. Buying a farm outside St. Louis, Grant failed. He failed again when he went into real estate. Finally, he moved home to Galena, Illinois, where he worked in his family's leather store. When the South seceded, Grant volunteered his services to the regular army. He was turned down by officers in Washington who remembered his earlier tippling. Fortunately for the Union, Grant was undaunted, and he quickly secured himself a commission in the Illinois State Militia. The rest is history. Grant's critics and rivals whispered maliciously in Lincoln's ear, but that great statesman was unmoved by the vicious accusations that Grant was an unchanged man. To suggestions that Grant should be removed, Lincoln answered, "I can't spare this man. He fights." Later, when control of the Union armies was handed over to Ulysses S. Grant, temperance advocates closely linked to the abolitionist movement demanded Lincoln remove Grant. "I wish I knew what he drank," Lincoln is reported to have replied. "I'd give a bottle of it to every one of my generals." For in 1862, while Grant was destroying Confederate forces in the West, the Union Army of the Potomac, under the command of General McClellan, was faring very poorly indeed in the symbolic East against the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, under the command of General Robert E. Lee. McClellan's administrative talents had ensured that the Army under his command was well-drilled, well-fed, and well-disciplined. But McClellan was a cautious man, and he continually put off an invasion of Virginia. This so infuriated Lincoln, who at the time was under tremendous pressure from the public to go forward to Richmond, that he stripped McClellan of command of all Union armies and told him to go into Virginia with his Army of the Potomac. McClellan complied, planting his 110,000-man army into an area outside Richmond known as the Wilderness. But instead of leapfrogging over small detachments of resistance and pressing on to the Confederate capital, the careful general concentrated on mopping up operations, laying siege to Yorktown and its small contingent of Confederate soldiers. This gave Confederate Generals Lee and Johnston time to counter. They sent Stonewall Jackson's cavalry out to harass Union troops and make a feint for Washington, D.C. The move had its intended effect, sending 50,000 Union troops scurrying to the defense of Washington and seriously depleting McClellan's strength. Although Union soldiers were able to win several skirmishes against the Confederate forces, the first real battle of the campaign, the Battle of Fair Oaks, ended in a standoff with Johnston's rebel troops. General Lee then took over command of the Confederate Army, and the cautious McClellan first took up defensive positions, then decided to move them. As he did so, Lee took the initiative, and the 7 days battle began. Between June 26th and July 1st, the Confederates attacked McClellan at Mechanicsville, Gaines Mill, Savage Station, Fraser's Farm, and Malvern Hill. In the battles, the Confederates lost some 20,000 men, the Union forces some 15,000. But despite their losses, the South prevailed. McClellan was forced to withdraw to Harrison's Landing, where he licked his wounds. He had been beaten in front of Richmond and forced to beat a hasty retreat, a stunning symbolic and tactical victory for the Confederacy. Union forces attempted to stop the disaster by sending more troops into Virginia under General John Pope, with orders to again try to take Richmond through the frontal assault. With McClellan and Pope both in the area, Union strategists supposed Lee would be outnumbered and outflanked. Faced by an overwhelming number of Union soldiers, Lee did the unthinkable, splitting his outnumbered forces in two and sending Stonewall Jackson around Pope's right to attack the Union forces amassed at Manassas Junction. Never expecting Lee's maneuver, Union generals were paralyzed. Lee faced down Pope on the old Bull Run battlefield, and in the Second Battle of Bull Run on August 29th and 30th, 1862, the Confederate Army smashed a force twice its size. Lincoln quickly restored McClellan to his post as commander of all Union forces, as Lee followed up on his victory at Bull Run with a crossing of the Potomac near Antietam Creek. Lee had convinced Confederate President Jefferson Davis to abandon the Confederacy's original strategy of defensive war and to take the offensive against the North, striking deep into Maryland and Pennsylvania. Lee's plan was to cut the Union states in two by seizing the important railroad communication center of Harrisburg. Davis reluctantly agreed to the new plans. Such a blow, he reasoned, might push England's Lord Palmerston and France's Napoleon III into formally recognizing the South, giving the nation Confederacy credibility in the world's eyes, and forcing Lincoln to the table. Things immediately began to go wrong for Lee. On September 13th, McClellan came into possession of a copy of General Lee's plan of a campaign, inadvertently dropped by one of Lee's lieutenants. The opposing forces fought a preliminary battle at South Mountain in Maryland, but 2 days later, on September 16th, the two armies crossed at Antietam Creek. On the small plains between the creek and the Potomac, Lee's armies could not perform the brilliant maneuvers they had become famous for, but they fought nonetheless. In the Battle of Antietam, Lee's forces were never forced to leave the field. But when the smoke cleared, 10,000 Confederate soldiers were dead. Although a full 13,000 Union soldiers also lied on the field of battle, mortally stricken, Lee was forced to recross the Potomac and give up his plans of northern conquest for the time being. Although the Battle of Antietam was technically a draw, it was the North that really won. In the wake of the Confederacy's success during the 7 Days Battle, both England and France appeared to be on the verge of recognizing the Confederate States of America. But Lee's failure to move beyond Antietam made the European powers reluctant to recognize the rebels immediately. In the interim, Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation, a document which freed the slaves and brought world opinion to the side of the Union. The moment came, Lincoln later explained, when I felt slavery must die, that the nation might live. On September 23, 1862, just 5 days after the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln published the Emancipation Proclamation. The night before, Lincoln gathered his cabinet and told them that he had made a pact with God to free the Southern slaves as soon as Lee was driven out of Maryland. Now that Lee had retreated, Lincoln followed through. News of the proclamation, which only applied to the rebel states where it could not be enforced, and not to the loyal slave states of West Virginia, Maryland, Tennessee, Delaware, and Kentucky, where it could, created a strong feeling abroad and permanently put off foreign recognition of the government in Richmond. But within the states of the North, it had an even greater impact.